Now, there are some nationally important economic developments in New South Wales over the past couple of days with the state budget, with moves on stamp duty and land tax, and with today's big news that threatens the casino licence for Crown Casino's Barangaroo building on Sydney Harbour. I'm joined now by the Shadow Treasurer for New South Wales, Labor MP Ryan Park. Thanks for joining us, Ryan. First up, should Crown be allowed to go ahead and operate a casino at Barangaroo after all the revelations that have come out through the inquiries into practices elsewhere?
Well, certainly concerning, and that's why we will be watching very closely when the Court Justice hands down her inquiry, looking at whether they're fit and proper, because these are concerning issues. There's no two ways about that, Chris, and we'll be paying very much attention to what they have to say when that report's handed down.
Yeah, so they've been asked not to open the gaming next month. It's a magnificent piece of architecture, the Crown Casino building on Barangaroo. It is just spectacular, but the suggestion is they should not open their casino, their gaming operations, until we get those findings from that inquiry. But in the meantime, they could open up with restaurants and the hotel and the like. But I would have thought the whole development would struggle to be financial if it doesn't get the licence. Yeah,
well, look, that premises will be fantastic for people to go and access, even without the gaming. But that's a commercial decision that Crown will have to make. But these are serious issues, and we can't just be handing over licences of casinos to anyone. And these have to be worked through. The inquiry has to be allowed to take its course, and we wait, as do many other people, including the government, on what that inquiry discovers and finds.
Now, when we look to the New South Wales state budget, one of the most interesting things here is the proposal to try and get rid of stamp duty on real estate purchases, to switch to a permanent land tax model, similar to what's been introduced in the ACT. Do you support that sort of move, and is it something that should be spread right across state governments across the country?
Well, Chris, we've always said we're actually open for tax reform. We wrote to the government and said if it's fairer, if it makes it easier for people to purchase a property, if it's better for the economy, we're prepared to have a look at it. We do have concerns, however, that this is a flat-based land tax, not a progressive one, as Ken Henry has recommended in previous reports that he's undertaken on tax reform. And that means that essentially the progressive way is a lot fairer for people, because it distinguishes between people who have low land value versus those with very high land value, and people pay different rates accordingly. And we think certainly that should be a part of the mix. We are concerned with this flat-based land tax that's currently on the books. We're also concerned that this will be the first time that farms are looking at being taxed, something that was never going to be a part of the mix, or we never undertook to be part of the mix going forward. And that's obviously raised some concerns for farmers and people in rural and regional areas on larger properties.
It's politically very difficult, which is why the economic argument has been going on for years and not much has happened. So we'll follow that one closely. I want to get your thoughts on border closures. New South Wales has kept its borders open to South Australia, Gladys Berejiklian wary, but always leaning towards keeping borders open. With such a heavy lockdown in South Australia now, it tends to support your call. How can we support South Australians travelling interstate when their own government won't allow them to travel outside their home?
Well, Chris, we've got a situation in South Australia now where it's easy for a South Australian resident to come to New South Wales than it is for them to go down to their local Bunnings or Woolworths and do the shopping. I mean, that doesn't make sense. What we need to do is do a quick, hard, short, fast border closure. 6 to 7 days, as the Premier Marshal's outlined for his state. We could make a really good assessment then about whether we've been able to contain it, to make sure that going forward the South Australians have got this under control, and that no South Australian resident puts our state, our businesses, our jobs and our livelihoods here in New South Wales at risk. Given the amount of work the community has done, given the sacrifice business have made in New South Wales, I just don't want to see all that put at risk when the South Australian Premier himself is virtually locking down internally his own state.
Look, well, I think you're wrong. I disagree with you. I support open borders, but it's so hard to argue the case against the closing a South Australian border now when Stephen Marshall has overreacted in such a dramatic way in his own state. We heard the Labor Premier in Western Australia talk about keeping the virus out. It is the case, isn't it, that state premiers, Liberal and Labor, Queensland, Tasmania, South Australia and Western Australia, they are pursuing a different strategy, an elimination strategy, rather than learning to live with the virus like we have done in New South Wales.
Yeah, well, look, I think we do have to learn to live with it. I've said all along that this is about a suppression, not an elimination. We've been clear on that. But when you've got a spike that is significant and that they're not sure of how significant it actually is, it could be even more than what they're saying today, then you've got to understand and got to take some cautious approaches, not long-term, but short, sharp, to make sure all the work that we have done in New South Wales, that our businesses have sacrificed, that our residents have sacrificed, all of that doesn't come undone. Because, Chris, the problem was in Victoria, one day there were 17 cases. Little under 2 weeks after that, there was over 100 cases. This coronavirus can take hold very, very quickly, and we just cannot afford. Our economy, our jobs, our livelihoods cannot afford another wave in New South Wales.
Now, you're a leading member of the famous and very powerful New South Wales Labor right faction, and despite Anthony Albanese being of the left faction, your faction supported him into the leadership. Have people in your own faction, the right of the Labor Party, started to lose patience with Anthony Albanese's leadership?
Oh, no, not at all. I think we're all supportive of Anthony Albanese's leadership. He's doing a great job. Leading in opposition in the middle of a global pandemic, Chris, is not easy. But I know both he and Jodi here in New South Wales are doing their very, very best and putting the case forward. And that's what is expected of
the former president of New South Wales Young Labor, Troy Brampston, who's worked for Kevin Rudd and Tony Burke, he's written Albo off, says that everybody's just about to jump off the bandwagon. Is he seriously under threat? That insight would suggest that he's under serious threat within the party.
No, I don't think he's under threat at all. I'm certainly not aware of that. And people have commentary and opinions about all political leaders, me just as much as the other ones, and all those in between. And that's a part of living in a democracy. We get that right to have that opinion. People will have those opinions, but I think Anthony's doing a really tough job. It's a difficult job at the moment, but he's doing it really well. He's certainly giving it 100%.
Ryan, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for your time, Chris.